It was a normal Saturday morning, the kind where you think the biggest problem you'll have is whether to mow the lawn before it gets too hot. My wife was outside, watering the flower beds, humming some tune I didn't recognize, and I was sitting on the porch with my coffee, staring at the sky. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually makes you feel safe, the kind of quiet that fools you. Then it happened. 3 men appeared at the end of our driveway. At first, I thought maybe they were neighbors out for a morning walk, but something felt off. They were wearing uniforms, dark pants, buttoned shirts, badges glinting in the sun, and they were walking directly toward us. There was a confidence in their steps, the kind you see in real cops, but my gut told me this wasn't right. My coffee froze halfway to my lips. They stopped in front of my wife, who had by now turned around and was staring at them like she'd just seen a ghost. One of the men stepped forward, holding a badge. "Ma'am, you're under arrest," he said, his voice low but firm. Arrest? My brain froze for a moment. I blinked. Did I just hear what I thought I heard? Arrest? For what? And who were these people? The word HOA didn't even enter my mind yet. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of prank. Maybe a viral video idea gone wrong. Maybe the neighbors were hiding cameras. But as I watched their faces, I realized they were serious. My wife's eyes widened, her face going pale. She tried to step back, her hands raised. "Arrest? Why, what did I do?" Her voice shook and my heart sank. I could feel the panic radiating off her, a wave of fear that made my stomach tighten. In that moment, I felt the urge to rush forward to protect her, but I also knew that if I made a sudden move, things could escalate. One of the men raised his hand as if to silence her. "You have the right to remain silent," he said, and my chest tightened. The words were absurd. They didn't even make sense in this context. Who talks like that in someone's driveway on a Saturday morning? Neighbors were starting to peek out from behind fences, whispering among themselves. I caught snippets. "Is that really legal? What the hell is going on?" They didn't move closer, just watched. The tension in the air grew thick. I could feel every second stretching out. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do without making the situation worse. The imposters didn't notice me yet, or maybe they assumed I was harmless. I forced myself to breathe slowly, pretending to sip my coffee, though it had long gone cold. I observed them closely. The badges were cheap-looking, plastic, the kind you'd get in a toy store. The uniforms weren't fitted properly, the shirts slightly too big, like they'd been borrowed or bought second-hand. But despite all that, the way they carried themselves was unsettling. They had a confidence that made you believe, if just for a moment, that maybe this was real. My wife's hands were trembling and she looked at me, silently pleading. She didn't need to say anything. I knew I had to handle this. But first, I had to assess the danger. I couldn't rush in blindly. One of them stepped closer to her. "Come with us," he said. There was a threatening edge in his tone. My blood ran cold. I could see how quickly things could spiral. One wrong move and this would turn into something none of us could control. I wanted to shout to tell them to back off, to call the police, but something stopped me. I needed to be smarter than they were. I needed to figure out if they were real cops, fake cops, or something worse. My mind was spinning through every scenario. I imagined headlines, homeowner held hostage in his own driveway by fake cops. It was ridiculous, terrifying, and almost cinematic in its absurdity. I forced myself to stay calm. I studied their faces, trying to find cracks, signs that revealed their deception. There were small ones, the way one of them kept glancing around nervously, the cheap stitching on their shirts, the way their badges reflected the sun in a dull, fake way. And then I noticed it. One of them had a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, but it looked like a toy, the buttons oversized and the plastic shiny. My heart rate spiked, but I felt a flicker of hope. They weren't real law enforcement. They were amateurs. Even so, amateurs with handcuffs and the audacity to try and arrest my wife in our driveway were dangerous. I couldn't underestimate them. As the tension stretched, I realized something crucial. I had to act, but I had to act smart. The next few minutes would decide everything. And in that moment, staring at the 3 imposters, I felt a mixture of anger, fear, and determination that this neighborhood was about to learn one very important lesson. Nobody threatens my family in my own home without consequences. And that was when I noticed the smallest detail that would change everything. A glint of plastic where a badge should have been, the telltale sign that these were not the people they claimed to be. My heart pounded, and I knew I had to think fast. The calm Saturday morning was over. The game had just begun. I took a step forward slowly, trying not to spook them while keeping my eyes locked on the three men in front of us. My wife clutched my arm, trembling, and whispered, "Who are these people?" I didn't have a simple answer yet. All I knew was they were imposters, but the question of how far they would go made my stomach churn. One of them cleared his throat, the fake confidence in his voice almost laughable. "Ma'am, you need to come with us. We have orders from the HOA." I blinked. HOA orders from the Homeowners Association. My brain spun. I'd seen strict HOA rules before: paint colors, lawn heights, mailbox decorations, but arrests. This was something else entirely. My wife looked at me, fear written across her face. I squeezed her hand, silently telling her to stay calm, even though my own heart was racing. The imposters didn't seem concerned about my presence yet. They assumed I was just a harmless bystander, maybe the husband too stunned to intervene. I studied them carefully. The guy speaking had a cheap plastic badge clipped to his chest. It caught the sun at a weird angle, the kind of reflection only a fake would make. His uniform looked stiff and slightly oversized, like something from a thrift store costume section. My mind was racing, cataloging every detail. These were amateurs, but armed amateurs with delusions of power can be dangerous. My wife tried to step back, and the man took a threatening step forward. "Don't move," he barked. Her lips quivered. I could see the panic in her eyes, the helplessness, and it made my blood boil. I wanted to rush them, but I knew I had to stay calm. One wrong move could turn a ridiculous situation deadly. One of the imposters fumbled with something at his belt. My heart skipped a beat. Was it a weapon? Handcuffs? My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. I realized I couldn't underestimate them. They were bold, untrained, and clearly willing to intimidate us. But they were also amateurs, and amateurs make mistakes. I glanced at my neighbors. Some were still peeking over fences, whispering among themselves, frozen like they were watching a live reality show. No one moved to help, but their presence added to the tension. It was as if the entire street was holding its breath. I decided to speak, my voice calm but firm. "Can I see your paperwork?" I asked. The words hung in the air. My wife looked at me, a mix of confusion and hope on her face. The imposters exchanged glances, and for a moment they seemed unsure. One of them fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a laminated sheet. I took it, squinting at the official-looking font. It was a newsletter, a fake citation. The entire thing was laughable if it weren't so terrifying. "This is your proof?" I asked, keeping my voice even. My mind was already planning the next move. I had to maintain control without escalating the situation. The tension in the air was suffocating. The imposters realized their bluff had been called, and their confident posture faltered slightly. Then one of them tried to regain authority. "You don't understand. We have orders," he said, voice shaking now. The words lacked conviction. I could see the cracks forming. My wife's eyes widened in relief, but I didn't let myself relax. I knew these people were unpredictable, and desperate people can be dangerous. I took another step closer. "Orders from who?" I asked. The fake cop hesitated. "From the HOA board," he muttered, like saying it would make it real. My jaw tightened. The absurdity of the situation was almost surreal. Here were grown men trying to arrest someone with nothing more than an overreaching homeowners association rule. Yet the danger was real. They had no understanding of boundaries, no concept of consequences. I could see it in their eyes, the uncertainty, the flicker of fear that only grows when a bluff is called. Every second felt stretched, as if time itself was holding its breath with us. Then the man closest to my wife moved slightly, reaching for her arm. My pulse spiked. I had to act fast, not with force yet, but with authority. I positioned myself so they couldn't get to her without passing me. My mind raced through options, calculating every possible outcome. This wasn't just about confrontation. It was about protecting my wife without letting things spiral out of control. In that moment, I realized one thing clearly. The situation had escalated beyond any normal HOA dispute. This wasn't about lawn care or paint colors anymore. This was about audacity, control, and the willingness of strangers to threaten someone's family, and I knew I couldn't let them win. The next move had to be precise. The tension was unbearable, but I was ready to take control. The calm Saturday morning was gone, and the real storm was just beginning. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm while my mind raced. The fake cops were inching closer to my wife, their confidence still lingering but noticeably shaky. I knew I had to do something, and fast. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about exposing these imposters for what they were before someone got hurt. "Do you really think you can just walk in here and arrest someone over a homeowners association dispute?" I asked, my voice low and steady. They blinked, caught off guard by my tone. One of them opened his mouth to reply but stopped, like he realized mid-word that he didn't know what to say. I let a small pause hang in the air. The kind of pause that makes people feel the weight of a situation, even if they don't understand it fully. My wife's trembling hands gripped mine, silently asking me to protect her. I could feel her fear and determination mingling with my own. And then I said it. The words came out smoothly, almost casual, but loaded with authority. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I command the U.S. Marshals." Their eyes widened instantly. I could see the shift, the bravado draining from their faces, replaced by uncertainty, even panic. One of them glanced at the others, and they exchanged silent, worried glances. Suddenly, the man who had been most aggressive looked like a kid caught stealing candy. My wife's eyes went wide, a mixture of disbelief and relief. She whispered, You command the Marshals." I nodded, trying to keep my composure. The tension in the air was electric. The imposters now realized they were dangerously out of their depth. I let the moment stretch just long enough for the weight of my words to sink in. Then I spoke again, calmly but firmly. "Step back, now, before someone gets hurt." My gaze was steady, and I could see that every ounce of their confidence had drained. The one closest to my wife hesitated, fumbling with his walkie-talkie, which I noticed again was clearly a toy. The buttons were oversized, and the plastic looked cheap. It was almost comical if the situation weren't so tense. One of them tried to regain composure. "We have orders," he stammered, voice quivering. I tilted my head, letting the words hang in the air. "Orders?" I asked. "From whom?" they faltered. "The HOA board," the man said weakly. The absurdity of it hit me, but there was no time to laugh. These men were desperate, and desperation can be dangerous. I took a slow step forward, closing the small distance between us. The imposters started shifting backward, their eyes darting around, looking for an escape route. They had no plan, no authority, nothing but bluster. I could almost see the panic building behind their eyes. The fake leader tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. I let my voice drop another notch, calm but deadly serious. "You are not cops. You are imposters, and if you touch her or try to enforce these fake orders, you are going to regret it." The words seemed to hang in the air like a physical force. I could see the uncertainty grow, the fear replacing the bravado that had brought them here in the first place. My wife's grip on my hand tightened. She whispered, "What do we do now?" I gave her a reassuring squeeze, though inside, my mind was racing. I couldn't underestimate them, not for a second. The fake cops were still dangerous because they didn't understand the consequences of their actions. They thought threats could intimidate us, but they had just realized they were in over their heads. One of the imposters took a step back, tripping over the edge of the driveway slightly. It was a small, almost cinematic moment, but it told me everything I needed to know. They were ready to crumble. I kept my stance calm, controlled, letting the tension build. The longer they realized their bluff had failed, the more desperate they would become. I could feel my pulse in my temples as I assessed them. The fake leader glanced toward my house, maybe looking for support, maybe reconsidering their choices. The fear was palpable now. They were amateurs, and I had just removed the one thing they had relied on, the illusion of authority. "Listen carefully," I said, letting every word carry weight. "Step away from my wife, leave my property, and never come near here again." The imposters hesitated, clearly weighing the threat I represented against whatever misguided plan they had thought would work. For the first time, I saw real hesitation, fear in their eyes, and it gave me a small surge of relief. I knew I had the upper hand, but the situation was far from over. The next moments would decide whether this confrontation ended peacefully or descended into chaos. The suspense hung in the air, thick and heavy, because I knew they could make one desperate move, and I had to be ready. And as I stood there, my wife trembling but safe beside me, I realized that this Saturday morning had changed forever. The calm was gone, replaced by a dangerous tension that only one side truly understood. I was ready to take control, and they were about to learn exactly who they were dealing with. I could feel my heart pounding, but my voice stayed calm. The imposters had realized they were outmatched, yet desperation has a way of making people reckless. The man closest to my wife took another tentative step forward, his hand hovering near his belt like he might try something stupid. I could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, but it was mixed with a stubbornness that made him dangerous. My wife gripped my arm tighter, whispering, "Don't let them touch me." I gave her a reassuring squeeze, silently promising that nothing would happen to her. But inside, I was calculating every possible move, every scenario. I had to end this without anyone getting hurt, but I couldn't afford hesitation. I spoke slowly, letting my words carry authority. "Step back. Now, you are not cops and you have no authority here." One of them muttered something under his breath, probably a protest, but it was weak. I could see the panic growing, the cracks widening. The realization that they were amateurs with no plan for actual enforcement was setting in. Then it happened. The man closest to my wife lunged slightly, a mix of fear and defiance in his movement. Instinctively, I moved in front of her, my stance firm. The tension exploded in that instant. My mind was racing, knowing that any misstep could turn this into a physical confrontation. I forced myself to stay calm, every muscle ready, every sense alert. The imposters were scrambling now, trying to figure out what to do. I noticed the fake badges glinting in the sunlight, the plastic so clearly fake it almost made me laugh if the situation weren't so tense. Their uniforms were wrinkled and too large, the cheap stitching showing on their sleeves. I cataloged every detail, mentally noting their weaknesses, because even desperate people leave traces of vulnerability. One of them, the supposed leader, tried to regain control. "We have orders, you don't understand," he shouted, his voice shaking. I tilted my head, letting the absurdity of it sink in. Orders from the HOA, the idea was laughable if it weren't so dangerous. My wife's eyes were wide, half in fear and half in disbelief, as she whispered, "This can't be real." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The imposters were about to realize that their bluff had completely failed. I took another step closer, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Listen carefully. You leave now or you'll find out exactly who I am." I could see them freeze. The tension was thick in the air, like static before a storm. They were calculating, panicking, desperate, and I was ready to exploit every ounce of their fear. Suddenly, one of them fumbled with the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. I noticed again how cheap and toy-like it was, the buttons oversized, and the plastic reflecting the sun in a dull, fake way. It was almost comical, except that the stakes were real. My pulse raced as I realized that any sudden move on their part could trigger chaos. They glanced at each other, fear spreading among them. Their eyes were darting toward escape routes, fences, my neighbors' yards. I could see the plan, or rather the lack of plan, collapsing in real time. The guy closest to my wife tried to regain composure, but his voice came out shaky. "You don't know what we can do," he said, the words hollow and unconvincing. I let out a slow breath, keeping my stance solid, watching them carefully. "I know exactly what you can do, and right now nothing. Step away, leave my property, and do not come back." The pause that followed was intense. The imposters hesitated, clearly weighing the threat I represented against whatever deluded plan they had hatched. My wife took a small step back, and I moved slightly to shield her. Her hand found mine again, a silent anchor in the chaos. I noticed her trembling had lessened slightly, the fear replaced by cautious relief as she realized I had control of the situation. Then the man closest to the driveway edge tripped slightly over the concrete. It was a small misstep, but it told me everything I needed to know. Their confidence was gone. Panic had taken over. Desperation was creeping into their faces, making them unpredictable. Every second felt like a countdown to the next move, one wrong choice and it could get ugly. I kept my voice steady, deliberate. "This is your final warning. Step back and leave or you will face real consequences." The imposters froze. The silence stretched, the kind of silence that makes hearts pound and palms sweat. My neighbors were watching, some whispering, none daring to intervene. The suspense was unbearable, but I could feel the momentum shifting. The amateurs had nowhere to hide. I glanced at my wife and gave her a reassuring nod. The calm Saturday morning was long gone. The absurdity, the fear, the chaos, it was all there, suspended in the air. The next few moments would determine if this confrontation ended with humiliation, escape, or disaster. The imposters were running out of options, and I was ready to make the next move. The tension hung heavy, like the calm before a storm, because one desperate act could ignite everything. I knew the imposters were desperate, their fake confidence crumbling with every second. They were amateurs, reckless, and foolish enough to think they could intimidate my wife in broad daylight. The thought of them lunging again, trying to grab her, made my pulse race. I had to act, and I had to act smart. There was no room for error. Without making any sudden moves that could provoke them, I reached slowly into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers tapped the screen, calling a number that I knew would make them freeze in place if they realized what was happening. The imposters didn't know yet that I wasn't bluffing. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and that ignorance was about to work in our favor. "Hello," I said quietly into the phone, keeping my voice calm and measured. "I need assistance at my property. There are individuals impersonating law enforcement and threatening my family." I paused, letting the words hang. "Yes, I'm certain. Please send immediate backup." As I spoke, the imposters shifted uneasily. They were still trying to maintain their authority, but the uncertainty in their eyes betrayed them. I could see the tiny flickers of panic, the subtle glances at each other, as if they were questioning whether this whole operation had been a good idea. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my pocket, letting a small, knowing smile touch my lips. I didn't say anything to the imposters, but the effect was immediate. I could see it in their posture, the way they hesitated, unsure of what to do next. They had no backup, no authority, no plan, and now the threat of real law enforcement loomed over them. My wife's grip on my arm loosened slightly, and she whispered, "Are you serious?" I nodded, keeping my tone calm. "Completely serious. You're going to see them leave very quickly." The tension in the air was still thick, but the balance of power had shifted. The imposters tried to bluff one last time. "We have authority," one stammered. His voice quivered. It was almost pitiful. I tilted my head and let silence answer him. The weight of the moment pressed down, thick and suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw movement down the street. Several unmarked vehicles approached, and I recognized them instantly. Real U.S. Marshals, moving with quiet precision, tactical and calm. The imposters froze in place, their eyes widening in sheer panic. Their bravado evaporated completely in an instant. What are they doing?" one of the imposters muttered, barely able to get the words out. The reality hit them like a brick wall. The calm Saturday morning had turned into a nightmare for them. They had no idea how to respond to professionals who were trained, armed, and completely in charge. The marshals moved efficiently, flanking the imposters, cutting off any possible escape routes. My neighbors were frozen, mouths open, watching the scene unfold like a live-action thriller. The tension in the air became almost unbearable because now the imposters were truly cornered. Every misstep could be their undoing. My wife looked at me, eyes wide. You didn't have to call them, did you?" she whispered. I smiled faintly. "I didn't have to, I just did." The calm, measured tone belied the adrenaline rushing through my veins. I had taken control, but the suspense was still at its peak. The imposters were about to face consequences far beyond what they imagined when they decided to play hero in our driveway. One of the imposters tried to run, a desperate move that only confirmed their panic. Two marshals intercepted him with quiet efficiency, guiding him gently but firmly to the ground. The other two were frozen, their faces pale as they realized there was no way out. The absurdity of their situation hit them fully. They had tried to act like authorities, and now real authorities were taking control. My wife took a deep breath, finally allowing herself to relax just a little. She squeezed my hand. "I can't believe this is happening," she said, her voice trembling. I nodded, letting the moment pass. The imposters were restrained, the threat neutralized, and yet the adrenaline still coursed through my veins. The marshals gave a few curt instructions to the imposters, and I watched silently, letting them handle the situation. The imposters were being escorted away, humiliated and confused, and I felt a small sense of satisfaction. The tension had reached its peak and was finally starting to release, but I knew the story wasn't quite over. The HOA president and neighbors were watching, and the message had been delivered loud and clear. You cannot threaten my family and expect to walk away unscathed. And even as the imposters disappeared into the vehicles, the suspense lingered. I knew this neighborhood would talk about this for months. The calm Saturday morning was gone forever, replaced by the knowledge that I was not someone to be underestimated. The real storm had arrived, and it had a name: consequences. The imposters were in full panic mode now. The moment the marshals arrived, their confidence evaporated like morning dew in the sun. But desperation makes people do crazy things, and I could see it in their eyes. They weren't thinking clearly. They were thinking only about getting away. One of them bolted toward a neighbor's yard, tripping over a sprinkler and falling face first into the wet grass. I couldn't help but let out a quiet laugh, even though the situation was tense. The other two glanced around, trying to figure out an escape plan. Their eyes darted to fences, driveways, anything that might give them an out. It was almost cinematic, the kind of chaos you only see in a bad action movie, except this time it was happening right in my driveway. I stepped forward, positioning myself strategically between my wife and the nearest imposter. My heart was racing, but my voice stayed calm. "Don't even think about it," I said, though I didn't raise my voice. Sometimes authority is in presence, not volume. The imposters froze for a moment, unsure of which way to turn. Then the one who had tripped scrambled to his feet and made a run for it down the street. I could see the panic in his movements, the flailing arms, the desperate glances over his shoulder. Two marshals moved smoothly, intercepting him before he could get far. The sudden precision contrasted sharply with the imposter's chaotic flailing. The second imposter tried a different tactic. He climbed over a low fence into a neighbor's yard, landing awkwardly on the other side. I stifled a chuckle at his graceless attempt. It was almost pathetic. The marshal covering him moved silently, quickly, guiding him back toward control. The imposters had no idea how outmatched they were. My wife gripped my hand tighter, half from fear and half from incredulity. "Are they really going to catch them?" she whispered. I nodded without taking my eyes off the scene. "Oh, they're going to catch them, trust me." It was a surreal moment, watching grown men behave like children running from consequences, while trained marshals handled every move with calm efficiency. The third imposter hesitated, as if weighing whether to surrender or try something reckless. His eyes darted around like a cornered animal. I could see his brain struggling to process the reality. He had no authority, no plan, and nowhere to run. I moved slightly closer, keeping my presence between him and my wife. The tension was electric, thick enough to touch. Then, in a desperate attempt, he made a run for the street, hopping to slip past the marshals. Two of them intercepted him before he even got halfway across, pinning him gently but firmly to the ground. The third imposter finally realized there was no escape and sank to his knees, defeated. The absurdity of the situation was almost comical if it weren't so tense. I could see my neighbors peeking over fences, their mouths open, eyes wide. Some were whispering excitedly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. This wasn't something they'd see every day. 3 imposters trying to act like cops being chased down in a suburban neighborhood by real U.S. Marshals. It was like a movie, but better because it was real. My wife let out a shaky laugh, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "I can't believe this," she said. I squeezed her hand. "I told you it would be fine, just trust me." The imposters were restrained now, surrounded by the marshals. Their bravado had vanished completely, replaced by fear, humiliation, and a dawning understanding that they had made a huge mistake. As the marshals guided them toward unmarked vehicles, I watched quietly. The suspense lingered because even though the immediate threat was neutralized, the neighborhood had witnessed every second. Stories would travel quickly, and everyone would remember that morning for a long time. I glanced at my wife and gave her a reassuring smile. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, but the sense of control was overwhelming. We had weathered the storm, and the imposters were finally facing the consequences of their reckless audacity. The calm suburban street had been transformed into a scene of chaos, tension, and unexpected humor. It was a Saturday morning no one would forget, and the lesson was clear. Never underestimate someone who knows how to handle real authority. And even as the imposters disappeared into the vehicles, escorted by the marshals, I knew the story wasn't completely over. The HOA president and the neighbors were still watching, silently processing what had just happened. The suspense was still in the air. The neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson about boundaries, authority, and audacity, and I had made sure no one would forget it anytime soon. The storm had passed, for now, but the memory of it would linger. Every glance down the street would remind us that things could escalate in unexpected ways, and that courage, calm, and knowing your own power can make all the difference when chaos shows up at your door. Once the imposters were restrained and under control, I turned my attention to the neighborhood itself. The chaos had drawn a small crowd of neighbors, peeking from behind fences and hedges, whispering in disbelief. But the person I was most concerned with wasn't a bystander. It was the HOA president, standing across the street, clutching her clipboard like it was a shield. She looked flustered, her perfect blouse slightly wrinkled, hair a little out of place. Her eyes darted nervously between the marshals and me, trying to figure out which one of us posed the greater threat. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head, attempting to construct some kind of authority in a situation where she clearly had none. I approached her slowly, keeping my voice calm and deliberate. "Madam, we need to talk," I said. She straightened, trying to appear composed, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. The absurdity of the situation was almost cinematic, an overconfident HOA president suddenly realizing that her rules and fines didn't carry nearly as much weight as she had imagined. This is outrageous," she stammered, her voice wavering. "You can't just—" I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Let me make this very clear. Sending fake cops to arrest my wife is illegal, it's dangerous, and it's completely unacceptable." I let each word sink in, watching her face change from indignation to panic. She opened her mouth again, trying to defend herself. I was just enforcing the rules." I shook my head slowly. "Enforcing the rules does not give you the right to impersonate law enforcement, threaten someone's family, or break the law. That is not how authority works. Not in my neighborhood, not anywhere in the United States." Her eyes widened and she looked around nervously, probably realizing the neighbors were now silently judging her every move. I could almost hear the whispers spreading through the small crowd. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. This was her moment of reckoning, and she knew it. I took another step closer, keeping my tone calm but firm. "You have two choices," I continued. "Apologize and accept the consequences of your actions, or face the legal ramifications. The choice is yours." Her face turned red, a mixture of anger and embarrassment, but I could see the resignation forming. She realized she had been outmaneuvered. I glanced at my wife, standing behind me, trying to hide a small smile. The situation was tense, but there was a certain satisfaction in seeing someone who had acted so arrogantly finally confronted with reality. I kept my voice steady, emphasizing each word for maximum effect. "This neighborhood is not a playground for your fantasies of authority. You will respect boundaries, or you will face consequences." She swallowed hard, fumbling with her clipboard. I apologize," she muttered, barely audible. It was humiliating, and I made sure to let the weight of the moment linger. The suspense in the air was thick, and the neighbors were fully invested. Every eye was on her, every heartbeat synchronized with the tension of the moment. Even though the immediate threat had passed, the aftermath was still unfolding. I allowed a small smirk to cross my face. "Good. Now understand this. Any future attempts to threaten my family, my property, or anyone under my roof will not be tolerated. Do you understand?" She nodded quickly, almost flinching under the intensity of my gaze. The neighbors exchanged glances, some suppressing laughter, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The absurdity of the morning had transformed into a cautionary tale, a story that would be recounted in hushed tones over the next weeks. The suspense had reached its peak, but the lesson had been delivered clearly. Authority must be respected, and boundaries are not optional. As I stepped back, keeping an eye on her, I felt a mixture of relief and triumph. The chaos had been contained, my wife was safe, and the message had been sent. Yet there was still a small ripple of tension, the kind that comes from knowing someone will think twice before overstepping again, but might still try in another way. The suspense lingered like the aftertaste of a storm. My wife squeezed my hand, finally allowing herself to relax. "I can't believe this," she whispered. I smiled, leaning close and whispering back, "Neither can they." The humor in the situation helped dissipate the tension just enough to let us breathe, while still keeping the lesson firmly in place. The HOA president slinked away, her clipboard held like a shield, humiliated but alive, aware that she had narrowly avoided worse consequences. The neighbors continued to watch, some shaking their heads, some laughing quietly. The drama of the morning had reached its climax, and the suspense was finally resolving. I knew, however, that the story would be retold countless times. The suspense, the confrontation, the audacity of the imposters, and the humiliation of the HOA president would make this neighborhood a little wiser, and a lot more cautious. The storm had passed, but the lessons lingered, and the tension left behind was a reminder that chaos can strike any time, but preparation, calm, and knowing your power make all the difference. The imposters were gone, the Marshals had taken control, and the HOA president had finally slunk back to her office, humiliated and silent. The tension that had gripped the street for hours was finally starting to lift, but the adrenaline in my veins hadn't yet subsided. I took a deep breath, letting the calm wash over me even as my eyes scanned the neighborhood. The message had been sent loud and clear. This house and my family were not to be toyed with. My wife stepped closer, still clutching my arm, and let out a shaky laugh. "I can't believe that just happened. It's like something out of a movie." I smiled, the corners of my mouth twitching in amusement. "I know," I said. "Except in this movie, everyone's about to learn a very important lesson." Neighbors were beginning to re-emerge from their hiding spots, whispering excitedly to each other. Some were laughing quietly, some shaking their heads in disbelief. It was the kind of chaos that becomes a story everyone tells over and over. The absurdity, the fear, and the triumph all rolled into one unforgettable Saturday morning. I walked over to the driveway where the imposters had tried their ridiculous stunt. The plastic badges, the crooked uniforms, even the toy walkie-talkies had been gathered by the Marshals as evidence. I bent down and picked one up, shaking my head in disbelief. "This was their plan," I muttered under my breath, partly amused and partly incredulous. It was almost comical how little they understood authority, but the consequences had been very real. My wife laughed again, a genuine sound this time, the tension of the morning melting from her shoulders. "You really didn't have to call in the Marshals," she said. I shrugged. "Maybe not," I admitted, "but it sure made the lesson stick." She rolled her eyes, but I could see the relief in her expression. The adrenaline that had gripped both of us was finally easing. I glanced toward the HOA president's house. She was watching from her window, her clipboard now crumpled slightly in frustration. I could see her lips moving, probably muttering some excuse or self-justification. It didn't matter. The humiliation had done its work. The neighborhood had witnessed authority and consequences being enforced in a way no one would forget. The Marshals lingered for a moment, giving instructions and final warnings. They reminded me that any future impersonation or harassment could result in serious legal consequences. I nodded, feeling a sense of calm satisfaction. The imposters had learned the hard way, and my family had been protected without a scratch. The suspense of the morning had finally resolved, leaving only relief and a lingering sense of empowerment. My wife leaned against me, shaking her head. "So what now?" she asked. I smiled faintly, looking around at the quieted street. "Now," I said, "we go back to normal, but everyone will remember today. The neighbors, the HOA president, even the imposters. The lesson has been learned." I could see the subtle reactions of the neighborhood. Neighbors whispering, shaking their heads, some laughing quietly to themselves. It was the kind of moment that would become part of local legend. A reminder that audacity has limits and that real authority cannot be faked. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway, I felt a sense of closure. The chaos, the tension, the fear, and the absurdity of the morning had all come to an end. My wife was safe, the imposters were dealt with, and the message had been delivered. This family and this neighborhood would not be intimidated. And yet, as I watched the street settle back into its usual quiet rhythm, I knew one thing for certain. The story of this Saturday morning would be told and retold. The suspense, The near chaos, the confrontation with the HOA president, and the audacity of the imposters would make it unforgettable. It was a victory, not just for us, but for anyone who believes that courage, calm, and knowing your own power can overcome even the most absurd threats. I looked at my wife, gave her a reassuring smile, and said, "Well, that's done, at least for now." She laughed softly, finally allowing herself to relax completely. The storm had passed, the chaos resolved, and peace returned to our home. The lesson lingered, clear and unmissable. Never underestimate someone who knows exactly how to handle authority, and never ever try to play cop when you're just pretending. The calm returned, but the memory of that morning, the suspense, the laughter, and the drama would remain. Forever etched into the neighborhood story, a testament to the power of courage, quick thinking, and knowing when to call in the real marshals. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.